a seminar series, and I started by calling the unseated territory. Traditional unseated territory of Muslim people. It's usually becomes something that's necessary. So that's why we have this first slide. And I invite you to take the pen if you have already read the truth of the consideration. With that, since we are a little bit late, I'd just like to welcome the group of me and the master students in IRES. Together with our Paul, who is college of here. And Georgia, she has a chemistry degree from Imperial College in the UK. And among other things, last summer she was working for Metro Vancouver, helping with their pharmaceuticals. And in her free time, she takes dialogue and other number of things. I won't repeat anything else that she's doing. But she's right now studying the science of relevance for chemical management policy. Georgia.
Thank you. Are we good? Can everyone do here? Okay, thanks for having me here today. I'm very excited to present on master's thesis research, characterizing diverging scientific perspectives of relevance to conflict management. Endocrine disruptors are a class of chemicals that can interfere with the body's hormones to cause a detrimental effect. These chemicals can act to mimic or block the action of the body's hormones and initiate a series of viral infections. And these chemicals are extremely widespread. They are present in numerous industrial products. These can include plastic. They can be used as the active ingredient in pharmaceuticals, for instance, the birth control pills, and they can also be present in pesticides and herbicides. So as these chemicals are so widespread and they have so many uses, once they are used, they can then end up contaminating the natural environment. And these chemicals can be quite persistent in various mediums as water, soil, and in the products that they use up. So humans can then be exposed to these compounds through numerous pathways, including ingestion, inhalation, and skin contact. And once people have been exposed to these chemicals, which can take place over very many years at low doses, exposure to these chemicals has been associated with a number of health impacts, hormone-mediated diseases, including cancer, diabetes, obesity, but it can be sometimes very difficult to try and study the links between these chemicals and health impacts. As on the previous slide, these chemicals can have very complex exposure routes, and people can be exposed through multiple different pathways simultaneously. There can also be a delay between exposure and the manifestation of health effects. And the effects and mechanisms through which these chemicals act in the body to potentially cause these health impacts are not completely understood, which creates lots of uncertainty in this research field. Numerous experts in different disciplines study the link between endocrine disruptors and human health. So scientists in the lab, for instance, can investigate whether a certain endocrine disruptor can interact with a hormonal receptor. And scientists in the field can try and establish the concentrations at which these chemicals are present in the environment. Different experts can have different ways of reasoning about valid knowledge. And this is quite broad, by which it means that different experts can view certain types of knowledge very differently. This can include that they look at the same knowledge and come to different conclusions on it, that they require different types of knowledge to reach the same conclusion. They require a different burden of proof, perhaps, or they place different types of values on different methods. So they value one type of scientific method higher than the other, or see certain approaches as more valid towards solving a certain problem. And this can lead to expert disagreements in policy advice. as these experts produce research which informs policy, but can also act as policy advisors. And this can be a problem in endocrine disruptor management when lots of experts come with their different views of what is valid knowledge that don't always align. And the assumption underlying this study is making these different ways of reasoning visible can help facilitate chemicals risk management, which I will talk a bit more about towards the end of the presentation. The aim of this study was to trial a new methodological approach, systematically characterize these different ways of reasoning from endocrine disruptor literature. And scientific literature was used as the medium of study, as it is these experts' main research outlet, and it is the type of material which can be used to inform policy. The method approach breaks down into two main pieces. The first is co-citation clustering, which was used as a means of paper selection. And the second is a grounded theory type of qualitative content analysis, really meant to characterize the ways of reasoning. So firstly, papers were identified researching endocrine disruptors in human health in the Web of Science database. The search terms were designed to include papers which did not even explicitly use the term endocrine disruptor. And these papers were clustered by co-citation. And this means, so on the diagram here, paper B and paper C are both cited by paper A. And if paper B and paper C were cited together in multiple papers, then they would have a high degree of co-citation. And then if you cluster the papers all together, then there are distinct groups of people who cite each other, or papers that tend to be cited together. And it is assumed for this study that these clusters represent expert communities. And this is because that the act of citing something is an act of recognizing that someone else's knowledge is valid. And if there are groups of people that tend to cite each other, then they tend to recognize each other's relevance to the discussion. And if these are quite distinct groups, then there are maybe people within these groups that tend to some degree communicate with each other, identify the value in each other's knowledge, which could be indicative of expert communities or distinct expert communities. Highly cited papers were selected from different clusters that appear to present different perspectives, and these were taken for further textual analysis using inductive and comparative coding. Again, this approach was used rather than just taking the most highly cited papers, because these potentially could align on the ways of reasoning they presented. This is a way of trying to make sure that a more diverse range of papers are selected that are not necessarily the most highly cited. And inductive coding was used to make sure that prior assumptions were not necessarily made about what these different ways of reasoning were. And going back to what is meant by a way of reasoning, it's generally how arguments are presented in papers. So an example here is BPA is a known endocrine disruptor found to bind with estrogen receptors and have estrogenic effects. So here it is being reasoned that BPA is a known, not debated, endocrine disruptor because it's been found to bind with estrogen receptors and have these effects. So because it has these qualities, it is an endocrine disruptor. And it was found that there are ways of reasoning related to specific topics observable from the paper's samples. So how different papers define what is meant by endocrine disruption. The views certain papers had on valuing different methods, epidemiological studies and animal or mechanistic studies. How these papers grouped or weighed different types of evidence together to reach conclusions. And how these papers reasoned about certain policy alternatives. And this is an interesting finding in itself, that within the scientific literature, you can observe reasonings about policy, generally seen that these reasonings take place at another level, not in the actual literature informing the policy. And these ways of reasoning are illustrative, not representative. this method has not been validated, and I'm not making the claim that these are the only ways of reasoning that exist in the literature, just simply that the ones observed here do. Further characterization work and validation will be undertaken. And lastly, although there are multiple different endocrine disrupting compounds, it is thought that the ways of reasoning here can transcend or be applicable to multiple chemicals, because these chemicals they behave in similar ways, and they are often evaluated through similar methods and grouped together in policy. The first way of reasoning relates to what different papers define as endocrine disruption. There were two main divergences here, with some papers seeing endocrine disruption as an inherent chemical property. Chemical is an endocrine disruptor, it isn't an endocrine disruptor, but this relates to the chemical in itself. Another way of reasoning sees endocrine disruption as an effect. A chemical can be an endocrine disruptor in a certain context. In a way, how it acts in the body is what makes it an endocrine disruptor. It's not necessarily a property inherent to the chemical. Papers also reasoned about inferences that could be taken from different methods. Epidemiological studies are used in endocrine disruptor research to see how exposure to a chemical relates to a health impact at a population level. So an example could be seeing how people exposed to a certain chemical, whether they then displayed a high incidence of a certain disease. Some papers argue that epidemiological studies have standalone value because they can catch latent effects, as in delayed effects, and association between exposure and a health impact can be used to infer causation, meaning that a chemical is in some way responsible for a health impact. Others say that epidemiological studies are complementary to animal studies, because although these studies can identify an association, a link between exposure and an effect, this cannot be used to infer causation, unlike the first line of reasoning. And that's because they view causation as coming from mechanistic or animal studies. And the third is that epidemiological studies have limited value because they cannot even identify association. And there are some examples of each of the above. So Vandenberg says that whether EDCs influence human disorders is no longer conjecture, because epidemiological shows this association, which can then be used to infer causation. Whilst another says that epidemiology is limited in its ability to draw causal inferences, but other methods can enable this causation to be established. Whilst another paper said that these studies are not actually even well suited to study association, because if you have one of your variables that is unknown, in this case chemical exposure, then you're not even able to make an associative claim. Another way of reasoning relates to how different papers draw evidence together. So it is still an ongoing debate in the literature whether there is sufficient evidence to assert that endocrine disruptors have detrimental health impacts. Some papers say that yes, the burden of evidence has been met. Others say no, but then reason through two different lines. One saying that there is not sufficient evidence to conclude whether endocrine disruptors cause harm at the concentrations they occur in the environment. You can maybe demonstrate that endocrine disruptors have a health effect in certain animal models, but if you cannot prove that this happens in the environment, then that evidence is not sufficient. Another says that if chemicals are evaluated individually, as they often are, then you cannot apply findings from one chemical to another, and you cannot make conclusions based on endocrine disruptors as a whole, based on individual endocrine disruptors. So Casas and Diverging say that the impact on human health through known or unknown effects of these chemicals is great. So in this line of reasoning, they do not actually need to know the detailed effects of these chemicals. They can tolerate quite a high degree of scientific uncertainty, but still make the claim that these chemicals can impact human health. whilst others say that even though we know the mechanisms through which these chemicals work in systems, we can still not say with certainty that these chemicals are involved for a particular disease. The conclusions, findings from these results are that there are different ways of reasoning observable in endocrine disruptor scientific literature, and that certain ways of reasoning appear to be irreconcilable. And the next step in this line is seeing how the different topics interrelate to formulate overall ways of reasoning. By this, seeing how if a paper responds or reasons one way related to a certain topic, do they also align on another topic, to try and then make some overall characterizations about the lines of reasoning. And the conclusions on the method is that it shows initial promise as a sampling tool to source papers illustrating different ways of reasoning, but further validation is required to see whether it is representative of the literature or it does reflect these experts' different lines of reasoning. The implications of this research is that in high uncertainty areas, such as establishing the link between endocrine disruptors and human health, it is often anticipated that further research can resolve these scientific debates. But if these differences are due to fundamental differences in how experts reason about the value of knowledge, then further research will not necessarily lead to resolution. They will still view the methods or still want to weigh evidence a certain way. So it won't necessarily solve these disagreements. However, making these different ways of reasoning visible and can help facilitate chemicals management. Currently, chemicals risk management is very unclear what these experts are disagreeing about, where these disagreements are coming from, and better understanding whether these disagreements do come from fundamental differences in how experts see knowledge can help facilitate this disagreement and make it more clear where these come from, which can then maybe lead to the development of tools for better facilitation, and can also help identify which perspectives are included and excluded in policy advice. And lastly, to acknowledge everyone who's contributed to this work, my supervisors, Camilla and Anne Hyper. Thank you for all their guidance and support, researchers in the Vector Lab, and funding. Thank you for listening. Here are the instructions for questions, which I think will be after Justin.
Or you can get started.
Okay, sounds good. I will get started introducing Justin. So I've been lucky to be Justin's friend for the past year and a half, as we've been studying alongside each other. And Justin is a master's student who's supervised by Nadia Cruz and Mom Omikar, but unfortunately, neither of them could be here today, so I have the honor of introducing Justin. And Justin's research is really interested in the intersection between energy transitions and indigenous rights. And the way Justin's approaching this research is a little bit novel in the sense that it tends to focus on modeling, because students are using new forms of analysis. So I guess what we're encouraging you to reflect on today is to be open-minded in hearing Justin's research. And yeah, enjoy.
Thank you. Remember, use one of these before. Okay. Is it not sharing?
Yes.
This little thing. Okay, how are we on Zoom? Folks good? Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Justin. Really happy to be here today presenting my research and thankful to everyone for taking the time to come listen. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I'll be talking about my research, which involves predicting the impact of minerals for a low carbon energy transition. So I'm going to start by talking about my positionality and how I relate to this research. And I'll talk a little bit about critical minerals and low carbon energy transition, specifically copper, which is what I'm focusing on. Then I'll talk about some of the difficulties I've experienced in the early stages of the research and where I've kind of ended up now. And then I'll talk about some of the relationships between extractive industries, the Canadian state, and Indigenous communities within these colonial borders. And then I'll talk a little bit about the parallel dynamics I see in terms of the geopolitics of resources. And then I'll close by sharing some common progressive paradigms with respect to just transitions and then some of my perspectives on it. So I am Vietnamese diaspora, which means I'm Vietnamese, but I don't live in Vietnam. And the reason for that is because my parents fled a brutal war of aggression on Vietnam by the United States. So through processes of colonial and imperialist violence, I ended up in the West and have sort of, kind of contributed to the settler colonial dynamics that exist here and have benefited from the resource extraction from the global South and also, slave labor and indigenous dispossession. So when I come to this research, it's through an internationalist lens where I acknowledge that the problems that have plagued my family and people for generations continue to this day. And anything that I do is to dismantle those problems. So critical minerals are just those which are key to produce certain technologies like renewable energy, like telecoms equipment, like medical equipment, and in some cases, military equipment. And so different nations will produce lists of minerals that they consider key. And then also these kind of face uncertainty in their supply chains, whether that's because of the geographic region they're in or the rarity of the mineral. And so some of the relevant minerals for the low carbon energy transition are things like lithium and cobalt for electric vehicle batteries, copper for the electrification of our infrastructure, or aluminum for a variety of things. And the low carbon energy transition is likely to create intense demand increases for these critical minerals because low carbon technologies are actually more mineral intensive than fossil fuel technologies. So if we have this wholesale transition of our energy infrastructure, we're going to see demand increases. And copper is a key commodity for British Columbia. So it's one of the biggest exports of the province. It generates a lot of revenue. If we are to electrify the entire world, we will see increases in copper demand. The amount of recycling will not meet the amount of demand increases we're going to see. So the thing about mining is you've probably heard that it causes a lot of damage. And that is true. It causes a lot of social ecological impacts, despite being a necessary process for the world we live in. Like none of this would exist without some sort of mineral extraction, right? So we can't pretend that we could just live in a world without mining. But we have to acknowledge that there are impacts associated with that activity. So when we call renewable energy clean energy, I think that's a bit of a misnomer. It's just less dirty, right? In the sense that you avoid carbon emissions, but there are always issues. So the problem is that these issues have varying degrees of quantifiability. We can measure things like water quality, air quality, even land cover change. But how do we measure things like, cultural extermination, dispossession of lands throughout time, changes to, like family dynamics? Those things are very difficult to measure quantifiably and over spatial scales. And so when I started out this research, I started at a global scale. I was trying to figure out what is the geospatial overlap between mining and indigenous communities worldwide what are the implications of that? And it was such a daunting task, so difficult to measure something like that, right? So then I decided, okay, maybe I should settle in on British Columbia. The data is better, it's more attainable, it's a smaller area to cover. But even that just gave me so many headaches trying to figure out, what is the sphere of influence of a mine? How do we define indigenous lands in a settler colony where people have been genocided and dispossessed and placed onto these tiny reservations? Is all of the land that's not those reservations considered just non-indigenous? So I think eventually I came to the conclusion that both me and the field weren't ready for a question of this nature. And so I moved to a more quantitative analysis based on remote sensing. So remote sensing uses satellite imagery and spectral profiles to analyze land cover. And I figured it was good to sort of have a mathematical basis for how we define the sphere of influence of mine. And so one of my goals in this research is to derive a formula that can relate mine parameters to the area of influence of a mine. So on the left, this is a mine in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And they used satellite imagery to detect changes in things like soil moisture over time. And so they could see, this data dates back to about 1970. So they could see from before the mine was implemented throughout the course of its life, how did things like soil moisture change? So I'm hoping to implement a similar methodology in British Columbia with a sample of copper mines to see if we can create a model that relates mine parameters such as the commodity that's being extracted, the type of mining that's, the mining technique that's being used, and the amount of material that's being extracted to the potential area of influence of that mine. And if we can create an accurate model that relates those mine parameters to that area of influence, this could be useful for predicting impacts in the future for increased mineral demand that I was talking about earlier, and also for siting decisions for these extraction projects. But when we talk about siting decisions, we have to talk about land, right? And we have to talk about the relationship between extractive industries, the Canadian state, and Indigenous communities within its colonial borders. I don't think it's a secret that that relationship is contentious, right? You see it all over the news, that there's conflict. But then you also see partnerships between Indigenous communities and mining companies. And so, obviously Indigenous communities are not a monolith, but this sort of striking difference in attitudes was always puzzling to me. And this text was very illuminating for me, Red Skin, White Mask by Dr. Glenn Coulthard, who's actually a professor at UBC. So he's from the Yellowknives Dene Nation, and he talks about in his book the Dene Nation's struggle with the Canadian land claims process. And he talks about how the Dene Nation had submitted to the Canadian state a land claim which allowed for their total sovereignty over their lands and a new political economy that was not dependent on non-renewable resource extraction. And in the land claims process, the Canadian state had built into it sort of this policy where no land claims could be finalized in process unless the Indigenous community submitting it gave up any sort of claims to sovereignty. So they could receive cultural recognition of their cultural practices, but they could never truly self-govern. And so this battle went on for decades, and eventually the Canadian state essentially won a war of attrition. And that is how, this is an example of how the Canadian state has constructed the relationships between itself and extractive industries and Indigenous communities, robbing them of their sovereignty in the name of resource extraction for profit. And so I think that this relationship actually is not necessarily unique. While it is specific to the community, we actually see parallel dynamics on the global scale between countries in the global north and underdeveloped countries in the global south. And so I have this clip to show.
But that expropriation of the third world has been going on for 400 years, brings us to another revelation, namely that the third world is not poor. You don't go to poor countries to make money. There are very few poor countries in this world. Most countries are rich. The Philippines are rich. Brazil is rich. Mexico is rich. Chile is rich. Only the people are poor. But there's billions to be made there, to be carved out and to be taken. There's been billions for 400 years. The capitalist European and North American powers have carved out and taken the timber, the flax, the hemp, the cocoa, the rum, the tin, the copper, the iron, the rubber, the bauxite, the slaves, and the cheap labor. They have taken out of these countries. These countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
Okay, we're back, I think. Okay, now we're good. Sorry about that. Okay, so that brings me to this question of whether the low carbon energy transition is a question of technology and policy or of sovereignty and political economy. And one could argue it's both, but I think I would argue that one trumps the other in the beginning. So I have these two quotes from some important texts that I found very illuminating, and I'm just going to read them really quick. The crux of the so-called Indian problem in the Western Hemisphere hinges on this question. What do Indians want? For us, it's a larger social problem of underdevelopment. Colonialism has deprived indigenous people and all people who are affected by it of the means to develop according to our needs, principles, and values. It begins with the land. We have been made Indians only because we have the most precious commodity to the settler states, land. And that's by the Red Nation in the Red Deal. And so this next quote, humanity confronts a great dilemma: to continue on the path of capitalism, depredation, and death, or to choose the path of harmony with nature and respect for life. It is imperative that we forge a new system that restores harmony with nature and among human beings. And in order for there to be balance with nature, there must first be equity among human beings. We propose to the peoples of the world the recovery, revalorization, and strengthening of the knowledge, wisdom, and ancestral practices of indigenous peoples, which are affirmed in the thought and practices of living well, recognizing Mother Earth as a living being with which we have an indivisible, interdependent, complementary, and spiritual relationship. And this was from the People's Agreement of Cochabamba, which was in 2010, a response to the Copenhagen Accords, which people in the global south found to be incredibly insufficient in addressing the climate crisis and its root causes. And so I want to close by talking about some of the progressive paradigms we see when talking about a just transition. There are obviously some far right Malthusian approaches to the climate crisis that I think most people in this audience do not agree with. So I just decided not to address those. But I loosely borrowed these paradigms from Max Isles' A People's Green New Deal, in which he describes some of the approaches. And I think it's important to think about what is our strategy, right? Like if we see these problems with addressing the climate crisis, how do we approach it? And I'm not going to read through all the bullet points, just because for the sake of time. But we have on the left this liberal social democratic solution led by the progressive sectors of the global north. And they are not bad policies. Like these things would address to some degree, like the unrestricted emissions that have been associated with the development of capitalism, but they are largely ignorant of demands from the global south, whether intentional or unintentional. And on the right, we have a revolutionary solution led by the indigenous peoples of the world and the oppressed masses of the global south. And so these platforms, while they do address some technical things like energy transitions, they are much more focused on questions of sovereignty and economic exploitation. They talk about grants of climate debt and reparations for colonialism in order to fund those transitions. They talk about degrowth in the global north, the decrease of energy use so that can offset the increase in energy use we should expect from economies that will develop to feed and house their people. And so to me, it is very clear that one of these solutions addresses the problem at the root, while one seeks to provide band-aids and continue to maintain a system that is crumbling and is not serving the masses of people. And I think the reason why in the global north, this solution on the left is often the farthest we go in terms of like radical solutions. There's a little bit of hubris on the part of people in these countries thinking that a solution to the climate crisis could not possibly come from the underdeveloped global south. These people who don't have access to education that we do, who don't have access to the technology that we do, which I think is just quite frankly racist and chauvinist. But there's also this element of suppression that happens, right? How many of you have heard about the People's Agreement of Cochabamba? You know, not everyone, right? Like we don't learn about it in our classes. We don't learn about it when they're talking about different climate proposals in media. It is not, and the majority of the world is behind proposals like this. The majority of the world is not caught up in these technical squabbles of whether it's biofuels or whether it's, you know, they are relevant and important issues, and we will have to get to those technical questions. But we cannot address those issues without first addressing those issues of sovereignty and foreign intervention. So as long as the US has its hands in all these countries via military intervention, as long as the World Bank, the UN, the IMF control the economy of the world, impose sanctions on countries trying to, you know, enact their sovereignty, we cannot have a sustainable world which approaches the low carbon energy transition in an ethical way. And so when we think about a large scale transition to renewable energy, we have to think about what are the implications of that and why is that positioned as the solution to the climate crisis, and consider whether it really is. Yeah, that's what I got for you today. Thank you so much for listening. So how do we want to do questions? Should I take mine first and then we'll have Georgia go? Okay. Yeah, I'll take questions in the chat and in person. Yes. Oh, for me, yeah. That's for Georgia. Just yeah. But for me, you can just ask it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing I know, like you talked about critical physical science.
Yeah.
When we're in China.
Mhm.
The last year, there's been like critical remote sensing that I've started to come out, and I was thinking that would be a good topic to kind of try to combine some of the, that sort of like the highly technical remote sensing stuff, which is sort of critical. Like, how can we use remote sensing, which is sort of in some ways the archetype of sort of
right.
Like, oh, I'm wondering if yeah.
Right.
How can you use it in a way that reflects those?
easy target to criticize because it is representative. But
Right.
anyways, I was just wondering if you had thought any bit about that as someone who's doing something.
Mhm.
And then the other question was, I was just curious more about your actual method for something.
Oh, yeah. Totally. So for folks on Zoom who couldn't hear, the question was about whether I've dove into the critical remote sensing literature. The answer is no. I'm fairly new to the remote sensing literature. I just recently changed my methods pretty drastically, just because I took a remote sensing course last term. And just as an engineer by trade, I'm very fascinated by technology and science and the scientific process. But then, obviously, like, I see these issues with technocratic decision making. And so I think, yeah, that is a literature I should be looking into. So appreciate the recommendation. As far as my methods go, I'll just go back to that slide. So I'm planning on choosing just a sample of copper mines in British Columbia, looking at hopefully ones that we have data from before they started operating, and then also looking at ones that have closed. So the sample of ones that whole time frame is within the data that we have is probably very small to non-existent. Copper mines operate for a long time, but it will at least tell us to some degree what was it like before mining came to this place, and what is it like during its operation, and then potentially after. And so using spatiotemporal analysis to say, this is what we can expect to see from a mine. Is it like, how far from the boundary of the mine could we expect to see these land cover impacts? And I know that leaves a lot to be desired in terms of other social ecological impacts, but that's the limitation. Gosh, I forgot. I should have done my due diligence in remembering what all the variables were in the equation, but all the data is, or all of these are band spectral signatures from Landsat. Yeah. So all of this, all inclusive, just Landsat data you could calculate. Yeah, no problem.
This phrase that we found is interesting and useful, and while this perspective is definitely led by many people, there are also many people who have applications for materially more material goods, more material opportunities, and that modify social legal. I'm curious about your reflections on that, maybe the limitations of or obstacles to that strategy when it comes to.
Yeah, so I think that the aspiration for just like more wealth, so to speak, from people in the global south is warranted and it makes sense. But I don't think that's incompatible with the decommodification of social needs, if that makes sense. I think we are more equipped to bring water to, continual access to clean water to everyone if that resource is decommodified, similarly to things like medical care. I know there is debates over resources, right? So if we have economies that run on the exports of minerals or petroleum, things like that, those are dicey issues. But I think it comes down to sovereignty. It comes down to allowing a nation to self-determine and allowing people's movements to guide the direction of their society, instead of letting the US determine who should be ruling a country for US interests.
Okay, so I have one question for the mentee answer and keep typing it and then I'll come back next. So the question we have is were any of the three paradigms you mentioned in the lecture? So there aren't necessarily like I haven't got to the point in my research where I'm kind of making the assertion that there are like overall lines of reasoning, whether the ways of reasoning related to each of the specific topics are dominant. There definitely seems to be maybe one or two papers which maybe presented a more polarized view on opposite ends of the spectrum under each topic, and within some various papers falling into the middle ground, like particularly with the epidemiology topic, it was kind of like only one or two papers that both said like, yes, these can demonstrate a causal link, or no, they can't even identify association. Most of the papers did kind of fall in the middle ground between them. So it seems that there is some polarization, but it's too, I think, early to tell what are the completely dominant ways of reasoning are. And also this method is not making the claim that these are necessarily representative, so it's not trying to figure out what are the most dominant ways of reasoning at this time. I don't think I have any more typed questions at the minute. Find my chat. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'll just ask one. I was curious about, so I love the bibliometric method, the kind of that same kind of citation analysis for my project too. But I was wondering about your choice to use post-citation as the way to define the community. And I guess whether or not you, so I was wondering, so citation within science, like we don't always cite because we agree with the ideas that, you know, we're right, right? Like, so I could cite a paper wrong or whatever. And so I'm wondering if, you know, often in the bibliometric literature, people look at community protection based off like co-authorship or other kinds of relationships. So like if I co-author a paper with you, then like approach or whatever. So I'm just curious if you had tried, I saw you use Boxview, or like, had you tried to compare like the co-authorship networks with your citation community networks and see how those groups compare? And just to see if maybe it might be interesting to see like, oh, like actually people who co-author together, like those groups aren't necessarily the same, or maybe they are. But so I don't know how to take that.
Is there overlap between co-citation and co-authorship?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely did consider that, and when I was designing the bibliometrics, like co-authorship definitely was one that I considered. Co-citation was chosen for certain reasons. Firstly, the papers are the units of analysis, not the authors. So it makes sense to use a type of analysis where you group the papers together as a unit and not the authors. And sorry, what was the other? Oh. Yeah. Yeah.
Both the presenters and so their